Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We wanted to tackle the topic of ambivalence. I think it's a really interesting idea when you drill down and think about how normal ambivalence is. And I hope that part of what we're going to do today is to normalize it, to discuss how this is a very normal reaction to a lot of different things in life. But it can really hamper us. It can keep us stuck. It can sabotage us. And so hopefully we can unpack a little bit around when ambivalence is normal and doesn't really keep us from moving forward, and when it's a real problem.
This idea of ambivalence, I was so refreshed to hear that this rises up from the same time period that Jung and Freud and Jung's mentor, Bleuler, were all in the early formations of psychological theory, and that this is really part of the early mucking around in how the psyche works.
Yeah, I mean, so the term was coined by Bleuler, who, if I'm recalling correctly, was working at the Berkeley Institute in Zurich with Jung in the early part of Jung's career.
And Bleuler tossed out in his thoughts that there were three main types of ambivalence: volitional, intellectual, and emotional. And these were generally categories of something to do with the will to take an action, something that the mind is wrestling through with conflicts of reason, or emotional ambivalence, for instance, loving and hating something or someone at the same time. And Freud grabbed onto this and integrated it into his psychology as well. And it also has some kind of an ancient theory going back. I mean, there's nuances of this that show up in Aristotle and other kinds of medieval writers. So that all goes to say that this question of ambivalence has been in the human conversation for a really, really long time.
Yes, it's not really a new concept, but what I think is new, at least it was for me with Jung, is that he puts ambivalence or ambivalence, multidirectional valence, trajectory, movement. He's willing to acknowledge how much of it is outside the control of ego. And therein lies the problem, because what is lying in the unconscious as a compensatory position to ego's desires is hard, very, very hard to resolve. It's like the person that says, I know I really should, and then you can fill in the gap. But something in the unconscious says, but I don't have the energy for it. I don't really want to. I don't know why, but I just can't get going on it.
Right. And Deb, that's a great place to really dig into this topic, because I think that perhaps one of the main ways that ambivalence manifests is that consciously we have one preference or one intention, but there's another agenda. There's an unconscious agenda that feels very differently about things. And so, this again is a reason that some people wind up coming into therapy, ambivalence, because either they consciously are aware that they have very mixed feelings about something, say, and can't make a decision, or they say, well, on the surface of my life, I show every sign of really wanting to, say, go to law school, for instance, but then I can't ever seem to do what needs to be done to get there. And so what's going on? Why, where is the force that's grabbing my ankle and holding me back?
Of where is my energy? Where is the life energy for this? The momentum, the passion, the meaning. And that's the part that's often so stymieing and that for people that they may well bring into the consulting room is that I don't know why I can't fill out that application for grad school. I always wanted to go to law school. I really should do it. But the passion and the energy, the libido as the energy is not there.
Well, and sometimes I think the energy is not there. It's like the energy isn't strong enough to fill one of the wells on either side of this pole, say, I mean, we're just using this as an example, but go to graduate school or not go to graduate school. It's like the energy is somehow balanced in between instead of kind of tipping over the scales in one direction or the other. I mean, I think that's how it often feels. Here's one of the ways that I see ambivalence working, in a clinical setting is a lot of the times we're kind of unaware of our ambivalence. We don't acknowledge it consciously. So we say, for example, I'm really excited to go to graduate school. I can't wait to go to graduate school. And all that's in consciousness is, yeah, this is great. And so the other parts of it are not acknowledged. And that's when we get held back, in my experience. What I will often say to people is, I think we're all ambivalent all the time about major decisions. I don't think that there's a single major life decision where it's not very normal to have strongly ambivalent feelings about it, whether it's school or career or marriage or having kids or, I mean, gosh, I don't know. I feel ambivalent about whether I want, Indian or Thai food on a given night. This is what I mean by I think it's really normal. And when the stakes are high, let's say going with our example about graduate school, I mean, you're talking about incurring debt. It's several years of your life. What if it doesn't wind up being a good investment? What if? There's all kinds of reasons that you might have some trepidation moving forward or some mixed feelings. And I don't think that's a problem. I think a little bit sometimes we have a cultural expectation that when we make a decision, we should feel 100%, that we should feel completely unambivalent. And I think that's not right. I think we should expect ourselves to feel ambivalent. I think the problem is when our ambivalence is entirely unconscious, then it tends to hold us back. But if we can acknowledge the parts that we're maybe afraid about, or that we can recognize that it's an imperfect answer to the dilemma that we're in. So we say, decided to go to graduate school. I know it's a risk, but I think it's a solid risk. I've done my homework and I feel excited about the study. And I think there's a good chance that it will be a good investment. Then I think we're prepared to move forward. I think we're really well prepared to move forward. It's just when we're trying to disavow the ambivalent feelings in order to kind of manufacture a false sense of certainty that we can get in trouble.
And letting the part that is doubtful or fearful, just plain anxious, have its full say of the anxiety about the financial investment. Am I really going to like it? Am I going to do well with it? Letting that part rise up and have its full say so that both polarities can have a voice in this inner debate. And then the energy can flow between conscious and unconscious, between those two parts of oneself.
Well, what I also find is that when the various inner figures come forward with their different opinions, that then there's an intermediary stage which is analyzing the arguments of the different parts of our inner committee. Because we're a multiplicity. And even though we have a fantasy that we are one singular ego making decisions, really, we are guided by an inner committee that can have divergent opinions. And some of those opinions can be highly irrational and even based on previous trauma that isn't relevant to the current situation. So I think we often have to analyze the veracity and the legitimacy of some of those inner arguments.
And allow movement of feelings of anxiety, even dread, uncertainty, hesitation around risk, lots and lots of things, but to allow the feeling part of us to have a full voice. We often think we should think our way through all this, And I say to people sometimes, if you could have thought your way through it, it would be done already.
Yeah, and I think a lot of decisions which are based on, let's say, avoiding pain and seeking pleasure are often clearer decisions. But where we get very ambivalent is when we're looking at a series of goals, and both of the goals might be equally pleasurable. So, for instance, if we're thinking about going to law school and we're ambivalent, but the other idea is, well, rather than go to law school, I'd like to kind of hitchhike across Europe and visit all of these countries with a couple of my friends and have a really wonderful time. And both going to law school has these wonderful future expectations, and hitchhiking across Europe for a year or two is also wonderful. And so there's a feeling of competing pleasure in the same time frame.
Yeah, I don't know that law school is actually pleasurable, but I see where you're going.
Yeah. But it's valuable. How about that?
Okay.
That you're not ambivalent about it being valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I find a lot of my clients trapped in that kind of a decision. And one of the ways that I can often help them move forward is to remind them that life is lived in a sequence. And it's funny that when people are trapped in ambivalence, there's a feeling that there's one chunk of time and only one thing can fit in that time. And anything that doesn't fit in that time slot is then abandoned. And they will unconsciously believe that. So when I remind my clients that you can go to law school and in the summers, you could hitchhike through Europe, or you could go to law school. And then once you have a really great job, then you can organize these other events that are deeply pleasurable to you. And that sounds like such common sense. But when people are trapped in the ambivalent lockup inside of them, they really do forget that life is lived in an unfolding sequence.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, Joseph, because one of the things that's coming up for me is that it is sometimes possible to sequence our pleasures, for example. But I sometimes I think that, and I love your term ambivalent lockup. I think that's just perfect. Sometimes the ambivalent lockup is this sort of, which is the other thing that came up for me is this idea of sort of fear of missing out. It's like we sort of want everything and we can't land on one thing, because the other thing that's true is that life only gets lived in choosing the particular. If we try to always keep all options open, I mean, sometimes that works, but sometimes that keeps us stuck in that ambivalent lockout. And I think that ambivalence, which is crippling, often has to do with an inability to sacrifice one of the positions.
Well, I think that's where I was kind of getting to with the idea of believing that life can be lived in a sequence, that there are a lot of choices that we feel locked up in because we can't believe that one of the choices will return to us later in life. That it feels like to not choose something is to kill it or to eviscerate it in some way. Now, sometimes that is true. There really is a window of opportunity. But what I find when I'm talking to people is that that feeling of urgency to have all of the choices is false, is unrealistic and untrue. But it does open up the conversation to what is the underlying structure that believes that all of the choices are urgent. Anything that isn't chosen will be forever lost. I mean, that's a really complicated paradigm that people have.
That brings up for me the idea of adaptation and adaptation to the external world's reality of you can't keep all options open. We do have to choose. We can choose in a sequence, as you've said, Joseph, of go to law school now and maybe hitchhike in Europe over the summer. But that there is a reality and a risk that looks like we're keeping all these options open, and that's a good thing. But it kills off the energy for life when we can't settle to a particular in the service of just adapting to reality and that we live in chronological time.
Mm-hmm. And making peace with that idea of chronological time,
Mm-hmm.
I think that can give us a great sense of peace.
I'm also thinking that some of it is the fear of making the wrong choice.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
oh my gosh, I went to law school and I went into debt and or whatever it might be. It might be getting married. It might be taking that job overseas. It might be any one of a number of things. And what if I screwed up? What if I chose the wrong thing? I really don't like law school.
Yeah, and I mean, some of these things, it is possible that you could make a consequential decision that would negatively impact the way you move forward, right? So there is this kind of high wire act that we're on all the time as we feel into our ambivalence.
And I think a lot of that has to do with having a strong enough, well adapted, flexible ego so that the person can say to him or herself, if I have made a mistake and I'm in the wrong program, I made the wrong move, I am going to be able to figure out a next step. I will be able to deal with the mistake and correct course. I am still here and I am able to direct the course of my own ship of life, as it were. The need to always make the right choices is not something that is running my life. We zigzag.
Yeah. No, I think this fear of regret is absolutely a huge factor that we're talking about. And it can lead to a really interesting conversation about what's going on in the psyche around regret. So some people have very powerful negative introjects, which are these inner figures that will just harass and make these sadistic claims and incredibly critical tapes that run in people's minds when they make, the slightest mistake, or they have a feeling of regret or remorse. And it's so painful because of how they treat themselves that the fear of regret puts them into that lockup. And I think that's much more common than people realize. The other thing is the idea of catastrophizing, that people, and I think this was in that wonderful book, Sapiens, that's been floating around for a while, that there's something about our very nature as sapiens makes us prone to a negative bias of imagination, that we have a natural tendency to think about the disastrous possibilities of things. And if we catastrophize about a quote unquote wrong decision, that will also put us in an ambivalent lockup.
Just wanting to circle back to the feeling of ambivalence. And, I think a lot of people experience it as very painful and uncomfortable. And it's so much easier to move forward, say, with a difficult decision when we're not aware of that ambivalence. So we can really tend to defend against the ambivalent feelings because it's we have to manage them. I mean, in some ways it's kind of close to this concept of cognitive dissonance, that we both want something and we don't want it, or we love it and we hate it. But I do think we do better when we just acknowledge that, hey, this is very human.
What I'm taking us to now is the activity and the life in the unconscious. So that oftentimes, in my view, ambivalence isn't between, this or that, because that's in consciousness of should I do X or should I do Y? What I have seen is ambivalence manifesting as an inability to get into life, of a kind of listlessness, energylessness, an ennui around finding some meaning, finding some purpose, simply having a sense of energy. And I know for Jung that relates to libido, which is concerned with movement in the psyche, and that those unconscious moving parts, as it were, have just become becalmed, it seems, in some kind of internal Sargasso Sea, where no choices, no energy, it hasn't even lifted itself up into the opportunity to choose between two things.
So the image that comes to mind is that a person is, sitting there looking at their life, and all of the choices in front of them hold the same internal value. And so therefore, if nothing seems better or worse than something else, if everything is just the same shade of gray, how would we create a motivating priority to guide our life forward? Is that a little bit like what you were saying, Deb?
I am still back in the realm where there's a vagueness and an ennui of where is the energy. Nothing has really appeared in consciousness as an opportunity to make a choice, and that it's part of the sort of self-regulation of the psyche, where the unconscious is carrying some kind of compensatory but unconscious load that has yet to be differentiated into conscious, discrete elements. And that is what I would be interested in, is what is going on in the psyche.
This is really interesting, Deb, and I'm thinking about Jung's concept of the opposites. Jung felt that the opposites were, I think about it as the way that the temperature differential in the atmosphere kind of drives our entire weather system on the whole planet. And it's this tension between the opposites and the psyche is what generates psychic energy and libido. And so if you think about it, if the opposites are sort of the engine of the psyche, then of course ambivalence is a tremendously important idea, right? And it is sort of like if there isn't enough, if it's not differentiated enough, if there isn't enough tension between the opposites, it's almost like if there isn't enough ambivalence, then we just don't even get going in a way.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking that what has often had to happen is for a person who has this kind of listless, don't know what I want to do with my life difficulty, that the unconscious is doing the self-regulation. And that what we want is to make that ambivalence conscious so that self-regulation can be more conscious. So I think we're back to our old friends of complexes and shadow that have remained largely in the unconscious and are halting movement into conscious life until they can be uncovered, spoken, dealt with, and integrated. It's a compensatory and balancing process, again, I think, that where the unconscious will take over the load that consciousness has not been able to assume, much as dreams do, that there's where the unconscious compensates.
Well, this makes me think about Jung's writings about Gnosticism, and which is a way that he was able to kind of move into an archetypal frame about a whole cosmology of opposites. So as Jung was writing about this, I believe it's in his volume on Ion, he's very interested in this view that, in the creation of the universe, in this theology, God begets the sun, and the sun then begets these pairs of opposites. And all of these pairs of opposites are kind of divine ideas that live in a world they call the pleroma. And the pleroma is a kind of heaven where the fullness of ideas allows them to have an independent, almost divine life. And that this is the natural blooming state of the universe. So as Jung wrestled around with this idea, it also affirmed his feeling that every time we take a conscious attitude, simultaneously, because human beings are shaped as a small cosmos, the opposite idea is birthed at the exact same moment somewhere in the unconscious. So every time we fall in love with somebody on a conscious level, somewhere in the unconscious, there's a seed idea of disliking that person or even hating them. And it's deep in the unconscious and quite far away, but that those two polarities have to thrum simultaneously and have a kind of current of life force, of psychological energy between them in order for any of the phenomena on that spectrum to exist.
Yeah, I think that that strikes me as essentially true psychologically, that we do always contain both aspects of things. And Joseph, I'm so glad you brought the Gnosticism into it. And of course, Jung also saw this kind of bivalence as existing. Well, it's a function, it's an essential quality of the archetypes, right? He said that the archetypes are always bivalent. So, for example, let's say the mother archetype. There is a positive aspect of the mother archetype: nurturing, giving, loving, selflessness, caring. And there's a negative pole of the mother archetype, and that would be, the devouring mother, the smothering mother, the critical mother. And it's like we don't get to have just one. So if there's a positive experience of the mother archetype, somewhere in the unconscious, as you were saying, there's some kind of compensatory energy of the negative pole. One always constellates the other, right? And Jung said somewhere that psychic life proceeds in pairs of opposites. So we're always kind of, in some sense, sometimes more consciously, sometimes less consciously, sort of zinging back and forth between these two positions, two or more positions, really, I think.
It's one of the images is that it's kind of like an electrical current that has to zing back and forth. There's energy there as the two opposites can talk to each other, wrestle with each other, struggle with each other, and that is what produces energy for life. Is not having everything just one way, but allowing both, and the energy that sizzles between the two poles to flow into life, which gives it direction, or in the psychological term, canalization, so that it can go somewhere instead of producing stasis.
And a great example of that, which is ubiquitous, and the listeners have probably heard this before, that, when a married couple says that they never argue or they've never had a fight, that's often a real red flag, that there's somehow a lack of awareness or permission for the polarity of love and anger to both manifest in the marriage. And often it can feel a little ominous when a couple legitimately never argues or disagrees. Where is all the disagreeable part of the relationship living? And that it's not conscious. And sometimes that can prefigure an explosive problem that's going to happen down the line.
Or some kind of cold, calm cutoff, with calm in quotes. So I'm taking this to a place I often go to, which is how laden with feeling these aspects of the unconscious are. Of when we are angry with someone, when we feel fury, and all kinds of other supposedly negative things. Those are the things that tend to get constellated in the unconscious as complexes and shadow, because they harbor, feelings that we think are not good, not nice, not right. And that takes energy away from life.
And this ability to consciously feel and know that we have different competing attitudes about any decision, any person, any object, both an internal object or an external object, the ability to tolerate knowledge of the competing ideas causes the conscious ego to grow. It causes a maturation in the personality.
And likewise, an inability to hold both can, as we've said before, can really just result in this kind of standstill. And I have a couple of little vignettes maybe to share about how this can function. So this is a story that comes to me from someone that I worked with, and I am sharing it with her permission. She was pregnant. She was expecting her first child. And her father had passed away, but her mother was planning on moving closer to her. And she was very, very excited about this and anticipating it and wanting it to happen before the baby was born, that kind of thing. So the mother put the house on the market and was just waiting to sell the house before she moved up. And the daughter was waiting in anticipation every single day. Were there any nibbles? How was the open house? And it was just nothing was happening. There were no nibbles. There were no, it just looked like the house wasn't going to sell. And we were doing some work around, her expectation, her anticipation of her mother moving. And I don't remember exactly how we got into it, but we leaned into, she was not aware of, she wasn't conscious of her own ambivalence, right? But we sort of touched into it. And she became aware that she was very much looking forward to her mother coming and helping her care for her child. But of course, there's a lot that comes with having a parent move, down the street from you. There's a lot of that can be pretty complicated, that can get messy. And in this case, she was aware that her mother had some health problems and that, what was that going to look like in 10 or 15 years, to have mom, living a couple blocks away and perhaps being dependent on her. As we drew this out and we talked about it, and there was a lot of feeling about it, she really came to own both sides of this image, this fantasy of mom coming and kind of, being sort of this loving grandmother on call to her child, but all the other things that might mean too. It rested into a new place with her where she felt like it was a more complicated desire to want her mother to move, to be near her, but she still wanted it. She really got in touch with that place, not in this idealized form anymore, but in, I want the whole thing, good or bad, And right after that session, she got a phone call that there'd been an offer on the house. Felt a little sort of, like somehow her ambivalence was being held in the outer world in terms of this real estate process.
Oh, that's a really good example, and it helps to ground all of this with a vignette such as you just offered. What I'm continuing to think about is that by bringing these bivalent and competing feelings into consciousness, it doesn't mean that we're going to act them out, but just having the awareness and allowing some of the negative feelings to have a seat at the table is all it takes. Because people are often, sort of like, well, I don't think I want to get in touch with, my anger. What if I wind up hitting people with 2x4s over the head? That is not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is just what happened for your client, Lisa, of, oh, that's a relief. There are going to be negatives, and it's okay for me to feel them because then I won't act them out.
Well, but there has to be something that you're also helping your client with, Lisa, which we all often do, is helping them find a stance towards which they can relate to what's negative. Yeah. Like for instance, when I'm working often with young people, there's a very explicit attitude that I will only say yes to something that's all wonderful.
Yeah, 100% exactly.
Wonderful.
Exactly.
I am following my bliss, God damn it. And if any of the ambivalence or the discomfort or suffering is acknowledged in the decision, it can be immediately discounted as an option.
Yeah, Joseph, I think you're hitting right on it when I say, I try to normalize this because, people really think, well, if I'm not 100%, then it must be wrong, right? I must not be meant to do it. That's perfect, what you're saying.
But that's a kind of all or nothing equation of it has to be at least 90% as a decision-making must-have, and it isn't. The old shades of gray, ambivalence. Very few things are all one thing or another.
I think that is absolutely the reality of it, but the difficulty is helping a client who has that rather, I think, a young attitude, or Melanie Klein would say the manic position, where they've somehow bought into the idea that life should be blissful and that that's the decision criteria. I mean, I actually think that's a generational problem. I hear it so much in younger people who've kind of come forward from this new orientation towards what to expect from one's life.
It's a kind of idealization of what life ought to be like. And I think there's also been a kind of positivism that isn't real, that has infused the culture of think positively, follow your bliss. What color is your parachute? You can do this. Let's go. And a dismissal of anything negative as being sort of like dragging your anchor or it will impede you. We have to be gung ho. No, we don't, actually.
And so part of what we work with clients is a maturation of attitudes, that to help a client understand that even in the normal sufferings of life, that there is a beauty in the things that we suffer. I have several clients that also have naturally melancholic temperaments. And the melancholic temperament, which is an old kind of Renaissance idea, is that people have this distribution of humors in the body and the soul. And melancholic temperaments often experience life with a kind of exquisite intensity, that things are excruciatingly pleasurable and excruciatingly painful, and that they live in this spectrum of intensities. And when a person like that can come to love the poetry of their life, then they can give up the fantasy that everything should be blissful. And there is beauty in our suffering. I think about another circumstance of this kind of tension, which, of course, as we're all aging, this is just a truth, but I see this in my clients, where somebody is a primary caregiver for an elderly and dying parent. And there's a tremendous amount of energy wanting the parent to survive, to recover. But then as a caregiver, there's often another feeling of wishing the parent would pass away, and that the tension of all of this would finally just be over. And often after that, people will come into therapy realizing they had both of those attitudes and have to do some real work to accept their own humanity in that moment, and that is a reasonable ambivalence.
That's really lovely, that phrase of accepting our humanity, of accepting that we do have mixed feelings, that we do have competing desires, we do have shadow elements. We're simply human. We're not idealized beings.
I want to lift this up into a slightly different direction. I don't know where this is going to go. I'm hoping you guys will pick this up and help me carry it, because I'm going to just drop it into the conversation here without really knowing how to tie it back to what we've been talking about. But I'm aware that, in attachment theory, which is a really important school of thought in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis too, there's this idea about ambivalent attachment. And in a nutshell, attachment theory looks at the way that our primary caregivers related to us in infancy and early childhood. And that sets the pattern often for how we relate to others later in life. And this is actually a very interesting area. It's also one in which there's been a lot of important research and a lot of kind of empirical knowledge about this. So there are these different attachment styles, and one of them is called ambivalent attachment. And it can kind of look like, in adulthood, you really, really, really want to be close with someone. And when they come towards you, it's like, no, get away from me, so it's this real kind of push-pull around intimacy. It can be very painful.
It's tied to very early bonding patterns, even if they are ambivalent or disorganized, with parents, with primary caregivers. So I think you've touched on something important, Lisa, to consider is what was it like when you were very young with your mother, father, caregiver? Was there basically a secure attachment within which the child's negative feelings could be accepted? Or was it a different feeling quality? Were you a happy kid?
Yeah, and if we talk about the secure position, which of course many of us don't have, but a child who has a secure attitude of attachment generally expects that the world is going to receive them in a positive way. So that as somebody is, let's say, looking at a basket of decisions that are before them, if there's a secure attachment, at least fundamentally, they feel that when they arrive and land in any of the decisions, that the environment will be kind to them and will generally want to help them. And that's very different from somebody who has a fearful or avoidant attachment where they feel that any move forward, any choice that moves them out of the known is going to result in something that's either dangerous or frightening.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that maybe, the link with how we've been exploring attachment previously is something like when we have a good container, there's room for both sets of feelings. I mean, for example, if you have a secure attachment with a parent, you as a child will feel hatred toward your parent because all kids do, but you'll also be able to express it.
There's a story about that. It's the young boy Max in the Maurice Sendak Wild Things
Yeah,
books.
yeah.
This little boy is stampeding around looking like he's dressed in a wolf suit and he's scaring the dog. And his mother yells at him and says, "That's it, go to your room, no supper." And then Max has this fantasy of going to this island where all the wild things live. And they growl and he growls back and they kind of have it out with one another, and Max becomes the king of all the wild things. So he's acting out all these aggressive, big, toothy kinds of complexes on the island. But then he gets lonely. And then from far, far away, he smells something good. So he decides to leave the kingdom of the wild things that exists in his imagination, of course. And he comes all the way back to his bedroom. And he discovers that his mother has left supper for him in his room, and it's still hot. So it's a beautiful story about the abiding love or secure attachment that Max has to his mother, where they will weather the storms of his anger or aggression and other affect.
Yeah, it creates room for the ambivalence to be held.
Yes, exactly. And when there is an insecure attachment, there has not been enough room for those feelings to be held securely it's not that the parent is going to say it's perfectly okay, like Max, to stampede around the house and scare the dog, but it will be held. The child is not going to be rejected. It's part of it.
Yeah, and so maybe in adulthood, if we haven't had that secure attachment, we do kind of ping back and forth between these different feelings, and it's very painful, and it's hard to find a sense of synthesis or integration or ability for those two things to be there together at the same time.
Yes. And I think it's often aggression that is the at the root of it with people of, can I move forward? Can I be aggressive? Can I say, this is what I want? Can I say to someone, no, I don't want that. I'm going to take this. Those of integrating aggression in a mature way that can move us forward, I think is often very much at the root of some of the difficulties people experience.
So I also wanted to go back, I think, to something that we've touched on before to talk about like when we don't own our ambivalence, how it can kind of get projected out into the world and make it harder for us to move forward. It can get projected onto other people. So let's see, for example, let's say that someone's offered a job, let's say, and maybe it's not all signed, sealed, and delivered yet, but there's been a verbal offer and it looks good. Okay. And then that person sort of mysteriously convinces himself that he's not going to get the job, right? And so I might work with, I've seen stuff like this, right? So then I might work with a person to wonder, like, what's going on that you're not sort of responding to the actual cues in the environment is that they want you. You know, maybe they're calling your references or something. Why are you getting stuck on I'm not going to get the job when that's not actually the input you're receiving? And oftentimes when you do that, what comes up is that the person's actually not sure that he wants the job. Maybe a part of him wants the job, but there's another part, again, that hasn't been acknowledged where he's really worried that he's not going to enjoy the work or that the commute's going to be terrible or whatever it is. And that instead of just owning that, it gets projected onto the other. And this can create problems, as you can imagine, in life and relationships, because then you start responding to something that's not actually true.
What I'm aware of here is how very complex and complexed ambivalence really can be, and how powerful the unconscious is, that it can manifest in all kinds of ways to hide parts of ourselves and our mixed feelings from ourselves. And so it's real work to lift up these other parts of ourselves. It sounds kind of easy, like, oh, I have mixed feelings about this. But the energy in the unconscious can easily just remain in the unconscious and sometimes hobble us in ways that we don't understand.
Tying it into just as a kind of summary idea that to be human is to be ambivalent. And even though there may be various cognitive tricks that people can play to create an artificial sense of certainty so that they can kind of march forward in a direction and suppress their ambivalence or suppress their anxiety, that part of our growth as human beings is to accept our innate ambivalence and to still make a choice because moving forward in our lives is valuable, and to be able to tolerate the fact that every choice we make is colored with its opposite, and that can create a kind of beautiful pastiche of ideas and feelings and nuances and makes life more rich.
And it can give us energy to move forward.
And it releases energy as well.
Yeah.
And that seems like a good place to move on to a dream. Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
So we have a dream from a 23-year-old man who is a college student. And here's the dream. I was walking on a cobbled street, looking for a store where honey was sold. I was looking for honey to heal. However, I don't know what was it that I needed to heal. I entered into the store through what seemed to be the back door. Inside, I saw wooden shelves with glass mason jars full of different colored honey on them. The room was rustic and had a dim light, though sunrays illuminated it. One of my great aunts from my mother's side, whose name is Carmen, was there working, filling up bottles with honey. She greeted me and was happy to see me, as she always is, and the owner of the place, whose face I don't remember, came to me and told me the honey would help me heal. He gave me honey. I think I ate it because it was for me to taste. I don't remember clearly. However, I do remember he also told me to cover my body with honey, especially over my arms, chest, belly, face, and hair. So he poured some honey on my hand, I think it was the left hand, because the hand was the most effective way to cover my body, according to him. I did cover. The honey had chunks of honeycomb in it. The owner told me to eat the honeycomb chunks, so I grabbed a honeycomb chunk I had in the left side of my neck with my right hand and ate it. It tasted delicious. Here's a bit of the context he provides. Though I don't know what I needed to heal, I felt hopeful, good, and welcomed by my great aunt and the owner of the store. And then he adds, I don't know if this is important, but the illumination of the place and the room I was in was that of solar rays, and it had an orange color like a sunset, some golden color too. Also, some rays passed through the mason jars and the glass bottles that had honey in them.
Well, dare I say that this seems like a relatively unambivalently positive dream?
I think you can dare to say that. And, of course, the obvious theme here is honey. And
Mhm.
I would be wildly curious as to what honey is to the dreamer, but we can discuss some of the significant aspects that occur to us of this image of honey, which really goes right straight into the archetypal realm of bees and nectar.
And sweetness.
The sweetness, and it's a preservative as well.
It is.
Well, and it does have antibacterial properties,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
So you could, I think, if you had, say, a wound and you needed it to heal, you could smear honey on it, and I think that's supposed to be helpful. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think that it was, particularly in the ancient world, used that way.
Mhm.
And they have found honey in the pyramids that is thousands of years old and still perfectly preserved.
So a couple things. It's interesting if we're going to sort of start right at the beginning that it's a cobbled street. Of course, we don't know where the streamer is. I mean, in the city where I live, Philadelphia, we do have a number of cobbled street. That's a relatively normal thing around here. If it's not, then it's maybe a nod to something old.
It very much feels like a nod to something old. And I think cobbled streets, even in cities in this day and age, often are older streets. But it does certainly have that feeling tone to it. And the dreamer is looking for a store, a place to access something. That's what stores are for. We can go in and we can purchase it. So the ego clearly seems to have some capital, some wherewithal to make this transaction.
And what do we make about the fact that he enters through the back door?
Well, when I think of entering through the back door, particularly of a store, that there's something slightly transgressive about it. It may require breaking with a norm in order for him to access the healing, breaking away with kind of a social expectation in order to access his healing, being a little tricky.
Yeah, there's something, yeah, being possibly. I mean, some stores do have front entrances and back entrances, but certainly the back entrance is less visible. It might be something that you're going to do in a way that won't be visible to the collective.
Mm-hmm.
I agree there's something a little transgressive, and oftentimes in places like malls, the backs will have a small sign that says, the XYZ shop. And there are storage rooms and various other things. So the persona of the store is not what you see when you go through the back door, the window display and all of those things that greet you when you go in the front. And yet there is a way to go in through the back door. It's where deliveries are made. But I'm thinking that it feels like we're in the realm a little bit of a kind of shadow realm of we have to go in the back way. And that's in casual conversation how things are phrased of, I got in through the back door.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, that's true.
So he enters the store through what seems to be the back door. And then here are this lovely image of all these glass mason jars full of different colored honey.
It's a beautiful image.
And it picks up your idea about the cobbled street, that the room is rustic. It has a dim light and the sunrays are illuminating it. My goodness, it feels really magical.
It also reminds me of the way a honeycomb itself looks, that the honeycomb have these little, somewhat circular chambers in them, like little mason jars, full of larvae, full of honey, so that the store could be imagined almost like a beehive. And that the great ant, like a queen bee, is there participating in all of this.
I think it's interesting that there's the great aunt and then there's the owner. And both of them seem like positive figures because, Carmen is happy to see him and the owner seems interested in healing. Of course, if I had this dreamer here, I would be really curious more about Carmen and more about the owner and ask explicitly about the feelings of those things. But in other words, there seems to be sort of perhaps a kind of, there's an archetypal feminine and an archetypal masculine here. So perhaps, we might wonder if it's a kind of mother complex, father complex, or, senex crone or something like that. But there's some kind of archetypal polarity here of the masculine and the feminine that seems strongly positive.
Yeah, both are presented in their positive aspect of a great aunt, like the great mother, and this great aunt is from the mother's side, is warm, happy to see me as she always is. And then the owner is the, sort of the authoritative, generous, masculine who knows that it will help him heal, gives it to him, and then further directs him in the uses of it, of spreading it over his body and eating some of the honeycomb. So both masculine and feminine are presented in their very positive aspect here.
And, I think it seems important that he tastes it and he eats the honeycomb chunks and he tastes the honey. So he's really taking this in.
He was taking it in. And also, I'm beginning to have this feeling that the young man is like a bee pupa. See, because when the queen bee, lays an egg, it's put into a kind of column of beeswax, much like a mason jar, and it's capped over with beeswax. And then when the pupa comes to its ripeness, it eats through the honeycomb. It eats through the wax, which is actually composed of honey. And then it emerges and then begins a kind of adult life. So I'm wondering if part of the process of him eating the honeycomb and returning to the hive, the store as a kind of hive, is this a symbol of him transitioning or beginning to, well, it could go a couple of ways, either returning to a kind of previous development, a regression, slathered in honey, returning into the cell of the pupa, and or enacting some kind of a transition to launch and preparing to eat through the honey and get ready to join his role in the hive.
I have to say that the way that the dream affects me is that it is purposive, not regressive. There's something about the honey, which comes from bees, and being fed and prepared in a way that seems so beneficent that it simply doesn't feel regressive to me.
Mm-hmm.
I have two additional thoughts. I think one is I'm stuck on this idea that the honey is needed for healing. So somehow there is a wound. That's not in the dream, but it's implied. There is a wound. Also, I'm just going to have a flight of imagination here, okay? I'm just making this up. But my hunch would be the dreamer gave us no context about what is going on in his life at the time. That part of the form was left blank. And my hunch would be that he has perhaps just passed through a difficult time or is in a difficult time, because that would be the compensating position for this dream. This dream feels so overwhelmingly positive and it's so sweet that I have to imagine it's compensating perhaps a real wound in the dreamer's psyche in a really lovely way. I mean, I think it's a real gift. And the psyche will give us gifts like this often when we're really struggling.
Yeah, that is a very real possibility. I think, Lisa, I think you've hit on something important. And we may have come to a place where we can stop for today.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.